The first sound wasn't the crying, it was the rope. Fibers rasping tight around small wrists, a knot pulled hard enough to make one of the boys flinch, though he didn't make a sound. Dust clung to his cheeks where tears had already fallen and dried, leaving pale tracks through the brown. The girl knelt between them, her dress torn at the hem, one arm wrapped around the smallest child like she could hold him together by force alone. "Don't look," she whispered. "Not to the crowd. To him." The youngest boy had his face buried in her shoulder, shaking. The oldest, no more than 9, stared at the ground, jaw clenched so tight his teeth creaked. Their ankles were tied, not chained. Rope was cheaper. Rope said temporary. Rope said this could still be called lawful by the right man with the right papers. They were on their knees in the open yard behind the livery stable, where the shade didn't reach. Noon light pressed down on them without mercy. Dust floated in the heat, stirred by boots, by horses' shifting weight, by the slow circling of men who pretended not to stare too long. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "3 of 'em," he said, tapping his ledger with a finger stained black by ink and tobacco. "No parents, no claims, picked up south of Dry Creek after the fire." Sheriff signed off. The girl's fingers dug into the boy's sleeve. "Please," she said, barely audible, "please don't." The man closest to her laughed under his breath. That was when the cowboy stopped walking. He'd been moving with the crowd, hat low, dust on his coat like everyone else. Just another man passing through a town that didn't bother to ask names anymore. His boots halted mid-step, heel half-raised, as if the ground itself had reached up and grabbed him. He didn't look at the auctioneer. He looked at the rope, at how the knot sat wrong on the smallest boy's wrists. Too tight, cutting circulation. He could see the fingers already turning pale. The cowboys swallowed. Around him murmurs rose and fell like flies, prices whispered, appraisals muttered, not of worth, of labor, of years. "Girl looks old enough to cook," someone said. "Boy's got shoulders," another replied. "Couple seasons he'll pull a plow." The girl lifted her chin, just enough for the cowboy to see her face. Her eyes were dry now. Something in her had shut that door. She stared straight ahead, jaw trembling, and said again, "Don't look." The auctioneer followed her gaze and noticed the cowb for the first time. "You there?" he called. "You buying or just breathing up space?" The cowboy didn't answer. He crouched instead. Slowly, careful not to startle them, his knees bent until he was level with the children, dust settling into the creases of his trousers. He rested one hand on the ground to steady himself. The smallest boy peeked out, just a sliver, eyes red and swollen. When he saw the cowboy's face, he flinched back. The cowboy tipped his hat, not to the crowd, to them. "That rope's too tight," he said quietly. The girl's eyes flicked to his hand, then to his belt, where a knife hung worn and honest. She shook her head once, a warning. The auctioneer snorted, "You interfering friend." The cowboy stood. He was taller than most, though he didn't straighten all the way. His shoulders carried a tired slope, like they'd been holding something heavy for too long. He turned just enough for the crowd to see him now. "I'll pay," he said. A pause. "For the rope," he added, "and whatever man thinks he owns it." A ripple moved through the onlookers, confusion first, then interest. The auctioneer smiled thinly. "That's so, well, that's kind of you, starting bid." "I'm not bidding," the cowboy said. Silence fell harder than the heat. The sheriff hadn't been standing close. He leaned against the stable wall, chewing on a stem of grass, hat tipped back. At the cowboy's words, he pushed off the boards and stepped forward. "Then you're in the wrong place," the sheriff said. "This is all proper." The girl's grip tightened. The oldest boy's shoulders squared, just a fraction. The cowboy met the sheriff's eyes. "Is it?" he asked. The sheriff smiled without warmth. "Papers say so." The cowboy nodded once, a small motion, like he was filing the moment away. He reached into his coat. The children tensed. He pulled out a folded bill and held it between 2 fingers. For the rope, he repeated, before it cuts him any deeper. The sheriff hesitated. Just long enough. The cowboy stepped forward, closed the distance, and pressed the bill into the auctioneer's chest. Not hard, firm, final. I won't ask again. The auctioneer looked to the sheriff. The sheriff looked at the crowd, at the faces watching, measuring. The girl held her breath. The cowboy knelt again. This time he didn't wait. His knife flashed once, clean, the rope fell slack. The smallest boy gasped as blood rushed back into his hands. Before anyone could speak, the cowboy leaned in, close enough that only the children could hear him. "Why? We are safe now," he whispered. And in that instant, every man in the yard understood something had just changed, though none of them yet knew how much it would cost. The sheriff didn't shout, he didn't reach for his gun, that was what made it worse. He simply watched as the rope slid away from the boy's wrists and dropped into the dust like a dead thing. Watched as the cowboy wiped his blade clean on his trouser leg and folded it back into its sheath. Watched the girl pull the smallest child closer, her body angling instinctively between the boys and the men around them. "You just cut county property," the sheriff said mildly. The cowboy rose to his feet. "They're not property," he replied. The sheriff exhaled through his nose. "You got a habit of telling men their business in my town." The cowboy glanced around, faces stared back, some curious, some uneasy, a few openly hostile, no one spoke. "I got a habit," the cowboy said, "of not walking past things that scream." The auctioneer scoffed. They were crying, not screaming. The cowboy's gaze snapped to him. "You ever had rope on your wrists?" he asked. "Long enough your hands go numb." The auctioneer shifted, said nothing. The sheriff stepped closer, close enough now that the children could hear his boots in the dirt. The girl's jaw tightened. The oldest boy lifted his chin, eyes flashing with something that looked like hate sharpened by fear. "You bought 'em?" the sheriff asked. "No," the cowboy said. "Then they ain't yours. They don't belong to you either." A beat passed, dust swirled between them. "You planning to take them with you?" the sheriff asked. The cowboy looked down. The girl followed his gaze, suspicion flickering across her face. She had learned fast, learned that kindness often came with a price. "If you are," she said suddenly, voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "say it plain." The cowboy met her eyes. "I don't aim to leave you here," he said. She searched his face, not for softness, for truth. "And then what?" she asked. The cowboy hesitated. That was all the answer she needed. "Everybody says that," she said quietly, "before." Something passed across his features, a tightening, not anger, something older. The sheriff smiled faintly. "Hear that? They don't trust you either." The cowboy ignored him. He reached into his coat again, slower this time, and pulled out a small leather pouch. He loosened the drawstring and poured its contents into his palm. Silver clinked softly. He held it out. "For food," he said to the girl, "for shoes, blankets, a place to sleep tonight." The girl didn't take it. "Why?" she asked. The word hung there, simple, sharp. The cowboy opened his mouth, closed it. He crouched again, bringing himself level with her. "Because I owe you," he said. Her brow furrowed. "You don't know us." "I know enough." The oldest boy spoke for the first time. His voice was rough, scraped raw by swallowed tears. "Did you start the fire?" he asked. The yard went still. The cowboy's eyes flicked to the sheriff, then back to the boy. "No," he said. "Did you watch it burn?" the boy pressed. The girl sucked in a breath. She hadn't asked that question. She already knew the answer mattered. The cowboy looked at the ground. "Yes," he said. The word landed like a stone dropped into a well. The girl stood abruptly, pulling the smallest boy with her. "Then don't touch us." The crowd murmured again. Satisfaction rippled through some faces, judgment through others. You see, the sheriff said softly, past always catches up. The cowboy straightened. It was 8 years ago. The girl laughed once, bitter. It was yesterday. He nodded, accepted it. I was riding escort for a cattle drive, he said, not loudly. He wasn't explaining, he was confessing. Passed near Dry Creek at dawn, saw smoke. The girl's breath hitched, despite herself. I could have turned off, he went on, could have ridden hard and warned folks. I didn't, I had orders, and I told myself someone else would do it. The sheriff folded his arms, interested now. I heard the shots from the ridge, the cowboy said. By the time I rode back, there wasn't much left. The girl's eyes burned into him. My pa was still alive, she said, when the barn caught. The cowboy's throat worked, I know. Her head snapped up, how? He reached into his coat once more. This time, his hand shook. He drew out a small object and held it between thumb and forefinger. A tin whistle, dented, blackened on one side. The girl staggered, as if struck. That was my brother, S, she whispered. The smallest boy looked up, confusion clouding his face. I had that, he said faintly, before. The cowboy nodded. You dropped it when you ran, I picked it up. Why do you still have it? The girl demanded. Because I never gave it back, he said, and because every time I thought about throwing it away, I remembered what it sounded like when I heard it through the smoke. Silence swallowed the yard. The she. Riff cleared his throat. Touching story, still doesn't change the law. The cowboy closed his fingers around the whistle. I'm not asking forgiveness, he said to the girl. I'm asking to make one thing right. She stared at him for a long time. The crowd faded. The heat faded. There was only this man and the past standing between them like a burned fence. You can't, she said finally. I can try. She shook her head. Trying is what men do when the cost isn't theirs. The oldest boy tugged her sleeve. We can't stay, he whispered. She looked at him, at the smallest boy, at the rope still lying in the dust. Her shoulders sagged, just a fraction. Get us out of town, she said to the cowboy. That's all. The sheriff's smile vanished. Now hold on. We're leaving, the cowboy said. The sheriff stepped into his path. You take them, you make this my business. The cowboy met his gaze. It always was. From the edge of the yard, a rider leaned in and muttered something to another. Words traveled fast in small towns. The girl glanced toward the road, toward the open country beyond. Men will come, she said. The cowboy nodded, I know. And somewhere beyond the stables, hoofbeats echoed, too many to belong to chance. The hoofbeats didn't rush in, they announced themselves. Slow at first, measured, like the riders wanted time for fear to spread ahead of them. The cowboy felt it in the ground before he heard it clearly, the faint vibration through the soles of his boots, a low tremor that made the dust near his feet shiver. He turned slightly, angling his body so he stood between the children and the open yard. The girl noticed. She shifted too, her hand tightening around the smallest boy's shoulder. The sheriff smiled again, this time with teeth. Sounds like you won't be riding alone after all, he said. From the far end of the street, shapes emerged through the heat shimmer. Horses first, then men, 5 of them, broad hats, rifles slung loose, not raised. That was the message, not a raid, a reminder. The crowd began to thin. Men found reasons to step back, to busy their hands. A woman pulled her child behind her skirts. Someone closed a shutter. The auctioneer slipped away without a word. The riders reined in at the edge of the yard. Their horses stamped, nostrils flaring. Dust rose and hung, catching the light like smoke. The man in front tipped his hat to the sheriff. Dalton, he drawled, you rang. Sheriff Dalton nodded once. Got ourselves a misunderstanding. The rider's eyes slid past him, landed on the cowboy, took in the stance, the position, the children. Well now, the rider said, that's so. He swung down from his saddle with practiced ease. His boots hit the dirt soft, almost polite. He adjusted his coat, then looked directly at the girl. "You folks causing trouble?" he asked her. She didn't answer. The smallest boy whimpered. She hushed him with a hand at his back, never taking her eyes off the stranger. The cowboy spoke instead. "They're leaving." The rider turned, smiled thinly. "With you?" "Yes, sir." The rider glanced at Dalton. "That permitted?" Dalton shrugged, not without settling accounts. The rider nodded slowly, as if considering a fine horse. Accounts have a way of coming due. He took a few steps closer, close enough now that the cowboy could smell tobacco and old leather. The rider's gaze flicked to the knife at the cowboy's belt, then to his face. "Haven't seen you around here before," the rider said. "I don't aim to be seen," the cowboy replied. "That right," the rider's smile widened. "Funny thing is, I know you." The girl's head snapped toward the cowboy. The rider snapped his fingers. "Grant Holloway," he said, "rode with the 7th out of Wichita, lost 3 men on the Cimarron Drive. Quiet sort, kept his mouth shut." Grant's jaw tightened. He hadn't heard his name spoken aloud in years. "You left the army," the rider went on, "went north, took ranch work, thought you'd buried all that." Grant said nothing. The rider leaned closer, lowered his voice. "Trouble is, some of us stayed." Dalton chuckled. "You always did have a memory for faces, Cole." Cole, the name settled heavy in Grant's chest. Cole Haskins straightened and turned his attention to the children again. "You know who signed those papers?" he asked the girl. She shook her head. "Men who lost land after the war," Cole said. "Men who were told folks down Dry Creek were sympathizers, traitors, enemy aid." "That was a lie," she said fiercely. "Most lies are," Cole replied calmly. "Doesn't stop 'em from being useful." Grant took a step forward. Cole's hand drifted, not to his gun, just near enough to remind. "Easy," Cole said. "Nobody wants blood in the yard, makes folks nervous." The girl's voice shook despite her effort to steady it. "What do you want?" Cole smiled at her. "Order." He looked back at Grant, "and maybe a lesson, for old time's sake." Dalton cleared his throat. "Children go back on the block, you walk away." "Why, that's the cleanest end." Grant laughed once. "No humor in it. You burn farms, sell children, call it order." Cole shrugged. "We call it surviving." Grant felt the whistle in his pocket, heavy as lead. "You remember the Cartwright place?" Cole asked suddenly. Grant's eyes flickered. "Big sycamore by the creek," Cole continued. "Barn painted white, family that wouldn't sell." The girl sucked in a sharp breath. "That was us," she whispered. Cole nodded. "Orders came down. I led the men." Grant's hands curled into fists. "I saw you on the ridge that morning," Cole said. "Watching, thought maybe you'd degrown a spine." Grant's voice was low. "I didn't." Cole spread his hands, "And here we are." One of the riders behind him shifted, resting his rifle against his shoulder. Not aiming, waiting. Dalton spoke up. "This don't have to turn ugly." Grant looked around, at the emptying yard, at the doors closed tight, at the children pressed together like birds before a storm. Then, from the far end of the street, a single horse trotted in. No hurry, no rifle showing, just an old bay with a familiar limp. The rider swung down slowly, an older man, weathered face, calloused hands. "Grant," the man called. Grant's head snapped around. "Eli." Eli Jensen tipped his hat. "Your gelding came back to my place this morning, saddled, figured that weren't a good sign." Murmurs rippled again, different now. Another rider appeared, then another. Men Grant had worked beside, fences mended together, cattle driven through storms. Cole's smile faltered. Dalton shifted his weight, uneasy. Grant didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, dust swirling around his boots, with 3 children at his back and the past riding straight toward him. And this time, he didn't look away. If you're still here with me, pause a second, take a breath. Think about that yard, dust hanging, men deciding who deserves mercy. And ask yourself this: if you were Grant, with the past closing in and children behind you, would you have stood your ground? If you want to know how this turns out, stay with me. This is the quiet moment that decides everything. The riders who had come with Cole didn't move. Neither did the men who arrived after Eli. They stood apart, an invisible line drawn in the dirt between memory and choice. Grant stepped away from the sheriff and knelt again, slower now. He set his hat on the ground and raised both hands so the children could see them. "No one's touching you," he said. The girl didn't answer. She watched his hands, his shoulders, the way his eyes never quite left the men with rifles. "What's your name?" he asked her. She hesitated, then, reluctantly, "Mara." Grant nodded. "I'm Grant." "I know," she said. That landed harder than accusation. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded blanket. Worn, clean, he offered it without moving closer. Mara took it after a long moment and wrapped it around the smallest boy, tucking it under his chin the way a mother would. The boy leaned into her, exhausted. The oldest boy, Jonah, watched Grant with open suspicion. "You going to leave when it gets bad?" he asked. Grant met his gaze. "No." Jonah searched his face, looking for cracks. "Men say that." Grant nodded. "They do." Mara's voice was low. "Why didn't you come down the hill?" Grant didn't pretend not to understand. He sat back on his heels, eyes on the dirt between them. "I was afraid," he said, "of losing my job, of crossing men with guns, of being wrong." She swallowed. "We lost everything." "I know." Silence stretched. Wind moved through the yard, lifting dust and setting it down again. Mara reached into the blanket and pulled out the tin whistle from Grant's hand, where he'd set it gently beside her. She turned it over, thumb tracing the dent. "My brother used to play this when the cows came in," she said. "He thought the tune helped them find the gate." Grant's mouth tightened. "I could hear it from the ridge." She looked up, anger flaring. "Then you heard us." "Yes. And still." "I stayed," he said, "and I hated myself for it every day after." Jonah scoffed. "That don't fix nothing." Grant nodded. "It doesn't." He reached for a canteen, uncorked it, and set it within their reach. Mara took a sip, then let Jonah drink. She wiped the smallest boy's mouth with her sleeve. Eli approached then, careful, hands open. He knelt a few paces away. "You kids hungry?" Jonah's eyes flicked to Mara. She hesitated, then nodded once. Eli broke bread, literal bread, torn into pieces, and passed it over. No rush, no talking, just food placed in waiting hands. The smallest boy ate like he was afraid it would disappear. Mara watched Grant as she ate. "You can't make them pay," she said. Grant looked toward Cole and Dalton, still conferring in low voices. "I'm not trying to." "What are you trying to do?" she asked. "Stand," he said, "this time." She considered that. Standing gets people killed. "Sometimes," he agreed. Jonah leaned closer, too. "Mara, I don't want to go back." "You won't," Grant said quickly. Mara's eyes snapped up. "You can't promise that." "I can promise I won't step aside." That earned a long look, not forgiveness, something else, a thin bridge laid over deep water. Mara handed the whistle back to Grant. "Keep it," she said, "but don't think it makes you good." Grant closed his fingers around it. "I won't." From the edge of the yard came the sound of boots. Cole approached alone this time, leaving his men behind. Dalton lingered near the stable, watching faces. Cole stopped a few paces away. "You always did like quiet," he said to Grant. "Makes folks underestimate you." Grant didn't stand. "You done talking?" Cole's eyes flicked to the children, then back. "You really going to throw your life away for this?" Grant's answer was simple. "I already did, 8 years ago." Cole snorted. "You think a moment like this fixes that?" Grant finally rose. He placed himself squarely between Cole and the children. "No," he said, "but it changes what comes next." Cole studied him, then glanced past at the growing knot of townsfolk, men shifting, murmuring, weighing where to stand. Mara tightened the blanket around the smallest boy. She took Jonah's hand. Hope didn't bloom, it flickered, small, dangerous. And sometimes that was enough. The crowd didn't surge forward. It didn't scatter either. It held. Men who had been pretending not to see now found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder. Old grudges, old debts, old silences pressed close, the kind of pressure that didn't need shouting to be felt. Cole sensed it. His confidence, so carefully worn, began to thin at the edges. "You all planning to make a sermon out of this?" he called out, forcing a laugh. "Because last I checked, the law's still the law." Eli stepped forward, slow, deliberate. "Law ain't always justice," he said. "You know that, Cole." Another man joined him, then another. Ranch hands, drovers, a storekeeper who'd lost a cousin at Dry Creek, a widow whose land papers had never come back signed. Dalton shifted uneasily. "This is getting out of hand." "It got out of hand years ago," someone said from the crowd. Cole's eyes flicked from face to face, counting, measuring. He realized too late that the numbers had shifted. Grant didn't draw his gun. He simply stood. Mara felt it before she understood it, the way the air changed when men decided something together. Jonah squeezed her hand. The smallest boy leaned against her, half asleep, safe for the first time in longer than he could remember. Cole took a step back. "Dalton." The sheriff swallowed. His authority felt suddenly thin. "We can talk this through." Eli shook his head. "Talking done." Another voice rose. "You signed those papers, Dalton." "And you watched the auctions," said another. Dalton's hand hovered near his badge, then fell away. Grant spoke then, not loud, but clear enough to carry. "These children aren't the end of this," he said. "They're what's been left behind." Cole laughed sharply. "You going to hang me with words?" "No," Grant said, "with witnesses." A murmur rippled, men nodded, women stepped forward, stories surfaced like bodies after a flood. Dalton backed up until his shoulders hit the stable wall. "You don't understand." "We understand plenty," Eli said. "Enough to send word east, enough to have you answer for it." Cole's jaw tightened. He glanced toward his men. They didn't move. One of them shifted his rifle, then let it slide back down. Cole exhaled slowly. "Fine," he said. "You win this one." Grant didn't relax. "You're leaving." Cole sneered. "And the kids?" "They go with me," Grant said. Cole looked at Mara. "You trust him?" Mara met his gaze without flinching. "I trust him not to run." That hurt more than forgiveness would have. Cole mounted his horse without another word. His men followed, eyes down. Dust rose behind them as they rode out, their power bleeding away with every hoofbeat. Dalton remained. Two men stepped up beside him, not threatening, certain. "You'll wait," Eli said. Dalton nodded. He had no other choice. Grant turned back to the children. "It'll take time," he said to Mara, testifying, riding back and forth. "You don't have to stay." Mara looked around the yard, the rope still in the dirt, the sun lowering. "We are tired of running," she said. Grant nodded. "Then we'll go slow." They didn't leave that day. They left the next morning. Grant saddled his horse before dawn. Mara watched from the porch of Eli's place, Jonah helping her tie the blanket around the smallest boy's shoulders. "You don't owe us everything," she said as Grant checked the cinch. "I know," he replied. She hesitated. "Where are we going?" "North," he said. "There's land that hasn't learned how to be cruel yet." She almost smiled at that. The road was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after something breaks and everyone waits to see what remains. Days passed, then weeks. They built a small cabin near a bend in the river, Nothing fancy, just enough. Grant worked the land with Jonah at his side. Mara learned the soil, learned the seasons, learned how to sleep without listening for boots. Trust came slow. Grant never rushed it. When the smallest boy woke screaming at night, Mara held him. Grant stayed outside, sitting on the step, listening. When Jonah snapped at him, Grant took it. When Mara went quiet for days, Grant waited. One afternoon, she handed him the whistle. "I want you to teach him," she said, nodding to the smallest boy, "if he wants." Grant took it carefully, "Only if he asks." She nodded. Word came months later. Dalton had been removed. Cole disappeared south. Papers were rewritten, not clean, but cleaner. Grant built 3 small markers near the sycamore by the creek. No names carved, just stones stacked carefully. Mara stood with him. She didn't cry. Time did what it always does. It softened edges, not wounds. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Mara sat on the porch watching Jonah practice with a rope. The smallest boy blew the whistle, off-key, joyful. Grant leaned against the post beside her. "You still angry?" he asked. She considered, "Yes." He nodded, "Me too." She looked at him then, really looked, "But it's quieter." "That's something," he said. She nodded. Years later, folks would talk about the cowboy who stood when others didn't, about the children who grew into something steady, about a place where the dust learned to settle. Grant kept the whistle on the mantle until the day the smallest boy asked for it back. Grant handed it over without hesitation. The sun dipped lower, wind moved through the grass, and for once the past stayed where it belonged, behind them.